excited to share with you my intro to GraphQL. So let's get started. So the first question I want to bring up is, why GraphQL? What are the benefits? Why not just continue using REST? Data fetching is a huge reason. Using queries to fetch data was a huge reason of why we started down the path of developing our GraphQL server. While GraphQL mutations are super powerful, we initially are focusing on queries and data fetching. So let's get into an example of why data fetching with GraphQL is so powerful and awesome. So an example here on the left, say I wanted to fetch a customer with some related objects like addresses and club memberships. With REST, I have to do 3 API calls to gather all the data that I need. With GraphQL, on the other hand, I'm able to request these 3 related objects easily within one HTTP request, saving me time and resources in the process. So let me repeat that. I can get everything I need in one HTTP call rather than a call per object I need. That's awesome. But let's dive a little deeper into data fetching. GraphQL not only makes data fetching easier, but it helps combat overfetching and underfetching as well. So let me explain. Going back to our previous REST example, there's the potential that I only need a few pieces of info from each of these 3 resources. But since I don't have control over what the data is returned, I may often be overfetching data, which can cause network request sizes to be larger and cause unnecessary database reads. However, with GraphQL, I can avoid the overfetching problem as I can specify the exact data that I need. Maybe I just care about the first and last name of the customer, when they signed up for their club memberships and which state codes they likely reside at. I'm only getting the data that I need. HTTP payload sizes are smaller. The backend isn't trying to load data it doesn't need to. Life is good. On the opposite side of overfetching, underfetching is also an issue that often occurs with REST APIs. Say we want to get a list of customers as well as the addresses for those customers. We've now introduced an N+1 problem, where for each customer, we need an additional API call to fetch those addresses. GraphQL helps solve that N+1 problem. Looking at the example here, I'm fetching the list of customers while also fetching their addresses within the same call. So now we're just reduced the number of calls, HTTP calls, to 1, where previously this was 51 for the first page of 50 customers, for example. That's amazing. Now you may be wondering, what's the performance like on this? Won't the GraphQL request take longer because it's loading so much more data? And I myself was actually shocked at the results. As of yesterday, we've introduced some new things called data loaders, which is technology released by Facebook that efficiently loads this data through queries in the backend. I won't bore you with the details, but I hit our REST API endpoint to load the first 50 customers, and that's it. I didn't even get to looping over and loading the addresses. So I did that request, and I filtered with the search of Paul as the name. I then made the same GraphQL request shown in the slide here, including the addresses, not just the customers. Same idea, search criteria of Paul. And the GraphQL on average beat the REST endpoint's response time. So let me repeat that. I was loading more data without even getting the addresses, and GraphQL was actually beating that, which is super awesome. That's a big goal, is I want to make sure that we are optimizing our queries to perform on par or better than REST, so we can get you guys the data as fast as you need it. So one other benefit is the schema and type system. Everything you can access and request is defined in a schema with types that enable a killer developer experience. From plugins and libraries that allow you to easily write queries with autocomplete to knowing exactly the type of each field that you're requesting, it makes building into GraphQL really accessible and fun. For example, if you're wanting to filter a list of carts by a channel, while writing that query, you'll get autocomplete suggestions as you see in this little animation, and validation as well, as the channel is an enum and the IntelliSense knows exactly the values allowed for that filter. So this is really cool. I've had a lot of fun writing these queries from the front end when we were using this in our admin panel. Similarly, you'll know that a field with a type of URL will be always a resolvable URL in a browser, and a date time field will always be a valid ISO UTC timestamp. I want to give you guys a little demo of something that's called the playground, which I'm really stoked to show you. So let me just bring this up here. So if you were to right now go to api.commerce7.com/GraphQL, you're going to be presented with this playground. And this is something that's hosted right on our Commerce7 GraphQL. On our GraphQL server. So right in here, I can come in and start making requests. I can go over here to this right side and click on this little docs. I can see all the queries that are available to me. So I can say, hey, cool, I can load a customer here. And these are all the fields and the types of those fields that I can request. I can go even further and say, oh, so this has a club memberships relationship, which returns an array of club membership type. I can get those fields, and it just keeps on going on. And this is a growing schema that, with one of our core values being incremental improvement, we're starting small with what we're offering here for the queries, but this is going to be continually growing, both in what you can request and the speed and optimizations of those requests. So let's go ahead and make a GraphQL query. So let's go ahead and grab an individual customer. Actually, so I was just looking at that. So I'm just going to go ahead and start typing here. I'm going to call this get customer. This is any arbitrary name you want to give it. We're going to pass in a variable. We know we need an ID. That's going to be of type GUID here. So now this is where the beauty of autocomplete comes in. If I hit Control Space, I can see all the available queries to me. So we're happy to be doing a customer. So let's go in here. It knows automatically that I need to pass in an ID, and that has to be of type GUID. So we're going to go ahead and just pass in our variable we set up above. And again, Control Space, I can see all the fields that I can request here. So let's get the first name, last name. Let's get their emails. I know this is an array, which contains an ID and an email. We can go get some club memberships. And let's say get the sign up date and let's see, delivery method. That's great. And now down below, we need to pass in an ID because we specified a variable. So these query variables here are in JSON format. So if I go in here, what's really cool is even here, auto completion is still working. It's saying, hey, you need this. It's a required variable. So we're going to go do an ID, paste that in there. And similarly to REST, GraphQL uses the same HTTP header style of passing the tenant and an authorization header. So I've already got this pre-populated for time's sake. So we go make this request, boom, I've got a custom record. I got all the data that I needed, only the data that I requested, really, I should say. And from here, I can go and copy that to a curl command, go run that in command line, see kind of how I can make this, using Axios or whatever HTTP thing you're using for your apps. And this is really cool. So we're really pumped about this. There's links to this on our documentation site, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on in the presentation. So just wanted to show you that really cool feature. All right. So next, I kind of wanted to dive into some design patterns of how we actually designed this schema. So first thing I want to talk about just briefly is the connection spec. This has become a standard in the GraphQL community, and you'll see companies like GitHub, Shopify, Facebook all adopting this pattern. What it is a way of representing a list of objects with pagination and metadata in mind. If you Google relay connection spec, you'll find it and you'll be able to read up all the benefits if you're interested. It's a big topic. It's when you look at the spec, it kind of looks a little bit confusing, but once you kind of read into it, there's a lot of benefits for doing this. So we took the spec and simplified it just a bit while still keeping true to the overall structure. We're currently supporting limit and offset pagination for all of our connections with the plan of supporting cursor-based in the near future. You'll be able to request the total count alongside an array of edges containing nodes with the type of being requested. All connections support this behavior, whether they are top-level queries or fields nested underneath another type. We've stuck with the naming convention of appending connection to these fields to be as explicit as possible in case we want to add a field that just returns an array of all objects without pagination or extra metadata, which leads me into my next design pattern. Finite lists or arrays of objects is something that you'll see when you're querying an order and you're wanting to get the items. It's most likely that if you're wanting order items, you're going to want them all and you're not going to want a subset of those. So for lists like these, we've chosen to return them as arrays of objects rather than using connections, and they're named appropriately so as well. This doesn't mean that we can't add a way of fetching order items with pagination and filtering down the road, but because of our naming conventions that we're being strict with, it allows us to do that without causing naming conflicts. So now we can have an items connection next to an items. So we're kind of just setting ourselves up for future there. On top of the default GraphQL scalar types of ID, string, int, float, and Boolean, we've added additional custom scalars to both ensure you integrators know exactly the format of the fields that you're requesting, but also to support validation for filters on queries and eventually inputs for mutations. This is really cool. It's just another way, and these are all documented in the schema. They actually have links to Wikipedia, to whatever standard they're following. For example, phone number is E164 standard. So it's really cool. You can dive into all that, and it's very explicit of what you're getting back. Lastly, I thought I'd just throw in a note about enums, as though even though these aren't built, or sorry, they're built into GraphQL and aren't exactly a design pattern, this is introducing a new standard for Commerce7 and enums. If you look at our V1 REST documentation, you'll see that there are enums alongside most objects, but they're in a human readable casing, mainly because it's easy to display those values in the front end without needing to map over them. However, enums in the GraphQL community are standardized as uppercase snake case, which is what we've done for all of our enums in our schema. When our V2 REST APIs launch later, all enums from V1 will be converted to this exact same casing, and interacting with both the REST and GraphQL APIs at this point will be consistent, meaning any mapping work that you may need to do if you're displaying one of these fields will be reusable no matter which API you're interfacing with. So the work is not going to waste. So as I mentioned, I wanted to talk about the future quickly. As I mentioned at the beginning, the main initial goal of GraphQL was to reduce the number of API calls needed to load various data from our admin. So we're going with incremental improvement there. Mutations will be coming. They just weren't a priority in the beginning, but we're excited to launch these, and we're looking for opportunities to really advance, because we didn't want to just do a straight up CRUD of mutations, just like REST. We want to provide things like maybe creating this club signup, which involves multiple different objects being created at the same time. Stuff like that you could see coming soon. Next is types and queries. Right now, on the left side here, you can see all of our current ones that we offer. If you go to the playground, you'll be able to see in the schema the queries. So in production right now, we have 13 queries with over 100 types and 57 enums. And this is, of course, a growing list. We're just getting started. I also mentioned during the connection spec that we support limit and offset pagination right now, but cursor pagination is coming in the near future, and that will come with the benefits of no rate limiting as well as no max pages you can get to. So I just want to link quickly to our documentation. Yeah, you're probably familiar with it. If you go to the same REST documentation, the very bottom left, there's a new section called GraphQL and a little intro to get started. This will kind of take you through the playground, has the link that also is on the slide here. And yeah, I encourage you guys to go and play around with that. There's also at the bottom some resources for some cool developer tools for in your code editors, as well as more kind of just intro to GraphQL type of resources. So yeah, thank you so much. That's been my presentation of Intro to GraphQL. I'll open it up for questions.
Hey, thanks, Kelton. That's awesome. If you do have questions, hopefully you could, we have no questions yet in the Q&A, but feel free to put a question there. We did have one in the chat, which is only available to panelists, and I think you hit it right at the end. But Kelton, will the docs be updated to support GraphQL?
That's correct. Yes, they're updated.
Awesome. So thank you, Justin, for that question. I got a couple questions. Do you see the REST API at Commerce7 going away?
We do not know. I think we're treating REST and GraphQL as two separate things. We have no plans in the next 3 to 4 years to get rid of REST. That's something that we'll always support. GraphQL is just going to be something that can help us get that data better, easier, and maybe with mutations introduce things that just aren't possible with a REST structure. So we're not getting rid of REST. Don't worry about that.
And you were responsible for moving the admin panel from the REST API over to the GraphQL API in several areas. Just tell us about the experience in doing that.
Yeah, it definitely was a bit of a struggle at first, mainly because we had a little bit of naming changes with the schema. So for example, under you may have noticed during the playground demo, we looked at delivery method instead of club delivery method. There's a couple naming things. So what we ended up doing is we developed kind of a pattern of using these transformers. So data would come in from REST and also from GraphQL, depending on which section of the admin panel you're in, and it would go through one unified transformer that would then kind of convert that to a fixed structure that we then would use and reference, and that would be stored then in our Redux cache. So that was kind of a cool pattern, and it was a struggle at first to get used to that, because there was maybe things that were missing in the little UI pieces, but once we nailed that in, it was it's super easy to add something in now and just kind of update it in one place. So.
2 more questions from the audience here. First question is, does GraphQL work with something like jQuery, and how's your website connect to GraphQL?
That's a great question. Yes, if you are currently accessing REST from jQuery, you can do the exact same thing. Just making basically an AJAX call would work. Essentially, it's a GraphQL requests, unlike REST, are always a post request. It's always to the same URL of api.commerce7.com/GraphQL. And you pass basically along a query and then any variables, as you saw in the demo there. You kind of can break those up to make your queries reusable and dynamic. So you can kind of pass that in as a JSON thing. But yeah, so that's a great question. But yeah, you can. It is an API. It's another way. It's HTTP protocol still. So anything you can communicate with REST can also communicate with GraphQL.
Okay. Second question. Apologize if I missed this, but do you have a migration guide coming out?
A migration guide as far as swapping from REST to GraphQL, it's kind of something, or is that kind of what, am I interpreting that correctly?
I would go with, do you have a guide from REST to GraphQL?
Okay, yeah, the intro to getting started kind of goes through making your first request, kind of like we just did in the playground. As far as migrating fully over from REST, there's a likely chance that there's resources that currently aren't available through GraphQL, so you'll need to basically use a mixture of those, of both GraphQL and REST. But a migration guide, really, once you start and see how you can make your first request, it's pretty. You'll be able to see kind of like the similarities there. I think it shouldn't be too hard. But if you have any questions, of course, you can hit me up on the partner Slack or email me directly. I've got on the slide here my contact information.
And last question. So Tyson, if you want to get warmed up for speaking, the last question here comes in is, are there different options for authorized or non-authorized queries similar to how the current product for web REST endpoints work?
That's a great question. So all the permissions that we have, both for apps integrating with REST API as well as actual users, exist similarly on GraphQL. So if, say, for example, you're grabbing products, there may be fields in there that are restricted to only if you are, an admin, or maybe you have a different permission level, and those will just won't basically return, and you'll get an authorization error, but you'll still get the rest of the data. So it's kind of interesting because you're each request can be completely unique, but at a field level, we actually have the ability to add those permissions. We've got those in there. So yeah, that's a great question. So if you'll basically be hitting the same, as of right now, you'd be hitting, a products query, but maybe there's fields on there that shouldn't be returned on the front end, and those just won't return. They would return null, for example, as a data result. So yeah, that's a great question. It's something that we also will be thinking about as we go forward. Thanks for that.
Two quick questions, which I'll just answer, and then we'll get to Tyson. But one question was, will all data eventually be be available in GraphQL? It would be my intention here. We have a product roadmap meeting on Monday on our team and stuff, but our intention would be to bring everything to GraphQL in the future, and that's the way forward for us. The other question is, are you guys recommending GraphQL is the way to go, or is it up to us totally, REST or GraphQL? We are going to maintain, as Tyson, or as Kelton earlier mentioned, our REST for the foreseeable future, 3, 4, 5 years. We have no future we have nothing in the future that's going to say, hey, REST is going away. We ourselves are going to go to GraphQL because we're seeing a performance improvement. When we first went up on the web, we were seeing a 4x improvement, but we're seeing even more improvement on our speed and everything else. And so our internal operations are going to move to GraphQL. We're already moved there with the busiest areas. So we actually, normally we'd start with a light area, but we would actually hit our orders, customers as the first objects to move over GraphQL. We're seeing great improvement, and we're going to continue to do that. So it's just up to use case.